The Grand Council chamber of the Galactic Alliance buzzed with activity as representatives from over 300 species gathered for their annual meeting. The massive chamber, crafted from crystalline structures and gleaming metals, reflected the power and prestige of the galaxy's most advanced civilizations. Tom Miller, the human representative, sat quietly in his designated spot, observing the proceedings with careful attention. Unlike the other representatives who wore elaborate battle armor or displayed their combat scars with pride, he wore a simple diplomatic suit. This difference in appearance didn't go unnoticed. "Look at them," rumbled Representative Core of the Battleborn, his scaled skin glinting under the chamber's lights. Even in formal meetings, they hide behind their soft clothes and gentle words. Several other representatives chuckled, their various forms of laughter echoing through the chamber. The humans had joined the Galactic Alliance only 50 years ago, and in that time, they had earned a reputation, not one they were proud of. In a galaxy where direct confrontation and displays of force were the norm, humans were seen as disappointingly timid. Their preference for diplomacy over combat and their tendency to retreat from direct conflicts had earned them the label of cowards. The main discussion today centered around colony protection protocols. Pirates had been raiding Outer Rim settlements, and the traditional response would have been to send warships to engage them in glorious battle. "We should crush these pirates," roared Representative Core, slamming his massive fist on the podium. "Show them the might of our combined forces." The chamber erupted in approving roars and battle cries. Tom raised his hand, waiting patiently to be acknowledged. When the council leader nodded in his direction, he stood up calmly. "Perhaps we could consider setting up an early warning system first," he suggested. "Combined with improved shield technology and escape protocols, we could save more lives." And the chamber exploded in dismissive laughter. Typical human response, someone shouted from the back. "Always looking for ways to run away. The raiders respect only strength," another voice added. "We must meet them with force." Tom sat down, his face neutral despite the mockery. The human delegation had grown used to such treatment. Their suggestions of setting up defensive systems, improving evacuation protocols, or finding diplomatic solutions were routinely dismissed as cowardly approaches. As the meeting continued, alerts suddenly flashed across the chamber's holographic displays. A massive energy signature had been detected at the edge of Alliance space, moving toward the populated sectors at an alarming speed. The warrior races immediately began discussing battle strategies. Representatives from the Battleborn, the Steel Claws, and the Star Hunters all volunteered their most powerful warships for what they called a glorious confrontation. Tom studied the readings carefully, noting patterns that others seemed to ignore in their rush to battle. He tried to point out unusual energy fluctuations that might be important, but his voice was drowned out by the war cries and battle plans. "Let the humans cower in their shelters," sneered Representative Core. "The true warriors of the galaxy will handle this threat." The council leader officially sanctioned the formation of a combined fleet, ignoring the human delegation's requests for more time to study the phenomenon. As the chamber emptied, filled with excited chatter about the upcoming battle, Tom remained in his seat, still analyzing the data. "You know they'll never listen to us," said his assistant, Jack, who stood nearby with a datapad. "Maybe not," Tom replied, his eyes fixed on the energy readings. "But something about this doesn't add up. And if I'm right..." He paused, looking at the retreating forms of the warrior race representatives. "If I'm right, their bravery might not be enough this time." As they left the chamber, the human delegation could hear the other representatives making battle preparations, their excited voices echoing through the halls. None of them noticed Tom quietly sending the strange energy readings back to Earth for further analysis. Sometimes Tom thought, the bravest thing wasn't charging into battle. It was being willing to step back, observe, and find a better way, even if everyone else called you a coward for it. The massive holographic display in Earth's Central Command lit up the darkened room with an ominous red glow. Tom Miller stood before his fellow officials, pointing at the strange energy signature that had now grown large enough to cover an entire sector of space. "It's moving faster than we initially calculated," he explained, his voice steady despite the worry evident in his eyes. "And its behavior doesn't match any known cosmic phenomenon in our database." The combined fleet of the warrior races had already assembled at the edge of populated space. Thousands of warships, representing the most powerful military forces in the galaxy, formed an impressive barrier between the approaching entity and the inhabited worlds. Back in the Galactic Alliance emergency session, Representative Kor was giving a rousing speech. "Today, we show the universe what true courage means." His voice boomed through the chamber. "Our mighty fleet will crush this invader." The human delegation sat silently, reviewing data streams from their advanced sensor arrays. Unlike the warrior race's basic scans, human sensors were designed to collect detailed information about composition, energy patterns, and behavioral characteristics. "Look at this," Jack whispered to Tom, pointing at a particular reading. "The entity's energy signature. It's not consistent with any known weapon system or attack pattern." Tom nodded grimly. He had noticed the same thing, but the warrior races weren't interested in such details. They saw a threat, and their solution was simple: attack it with everything they had. The human science team had been working round the clock, analyzing every piece of data they could gather. Their findings were troubling, but nobody would listen. The warrior races were too busy preparing for their glorious battle. "The entity isn't just big," Dr. Wilson, Earth's leading astrophysicist, explained during an emergency briefing. "It's complex. These energy patterns suggest some form of intelligence, but not necessarily hostility." Communications from the combined fleet filled the Alliance channels with battle preparations and boasts of upcoming victory. The warrior races were in their element, ready to face what they saw as the greatest battle of their time. Then the entity arrived. The first views of it sent shockwaves through the galaxy. It was beautiful in a terrifying way. A swirling mass of energy and matter that seemed to bend the very fabric of space around it. Colors that had no names in any language danced across its surface. "All ships, attack." Kor's command thundered through the communication channels. "Show no fear. Show no mercy." The human observation posts recorded everything that happened next. The combined fleet, representing the greatest military force ever assembled in the galaxy, launched their attack. Energy weapons, antimatter torpedoes, and quantum disruptors. The most powerful weapons in existence were fired simultaneously at the entity. Tom and his team watched in horror as their predictions came true. The weapons didn't just fail. They passed through the entity as if it wasn't even there. Some disappeared into the swirling mass, while others emerged from different points, changed, and distorted. "By the stars," someone whispered in the command center. The entity's response wasn't what anyone expected. Instead of attacking, it simply continued its advance. Ships that got too close began to break apart, their molecular bonds simply ceasing to exist. It wasn't an attack. The ships were simply being unmade by the entity's natural presence. The proud warrior fleet began to fall back in disarray. Their weapons useless, their shields meaningless, they retreated for the first time in their history. The galaxy's bravest warriors had met something they couldn't fight. "Send the data to the Alliance Council," Tom ordered, his voice tight with urgency. "All of it. They need to understand what we're really dealing with." As the remnants of the combined fleet scattered, emergency signals flooded the Alliance channels. The entity was still advancing, unchanged and unstoppable, heading directly toward the most populated regions of the galaxy. In the council chamber, the warrior race's representatives stood in shocked silence. Their greatest weapons had failed. Their bravest warriors had retreated. For the first time in galactic history, direct confrontation had proven completely useless. And in that moment of crisis, all eyes slowly turned toward the human delegation. The cowards who had insisted on studying and understanding before attacking might be the only ones with any answers left. The aftermath of the failed attack hung heavy over the Galactic Alliance. Emergency alarms blared through every populated system as the entity continued its relentless advance. The proud warrior race's fleet, once the mightiest force in known space, now lay scattered and broken. In the council chamber, Representative Kor stood at the podium, his usual confidence shattered. We hit it with everything," he reported, his voice hollow. "The combined fleet's most powerful weapons didn't even scratch it. We lost 300 ships just from getting too close." The chamber, usually filled with boisterous declarations and battle cries, was eerily quiet. Holographic displays showed the current position of the entity, now less than a week away from the nearest populated system. "Our greatest warriors," the Star Hunter representative whispered. "They just disappeared. Their ships simply stopped existing when they got too close." The human delegation had set up a temporary command center in their section of the chamber. Streams of data flowed across their screens as they continued to monitor and analyze the entity's behavior. Tom stood at his station, watching the readings with growing concern. "The dissolution field is expanding," he reported to the chamber. "The area where matter breaks down is growing larger." He paused, letting the implications sink in. "At this rate, it will affect an entire star system when it arrives." A panic began to spread through the chamber. The warrior races, for the first time in their history, had no answer. Their entire civilization was built on the principle that any problem could be solved with sufficient force and courage. Now, faced with something that completely ignored their greatest weapons, they were lost. "We must fight," shouted someone from the back of the chamber, but the words lacked conviction. We must gather more ships." "To what end?" asked the Steel Claw representative, their metallic features reflecting the red warning lights. "You saw what happened. Our weapons passed right through it. We couldn't even affect it." The emergency channels were flooded with reports from the outer systems. The entity's influence was already being felt. On the edges of its approach path, delicate scientific instruments were failing. Quantum communications were becoming unreliable. Reality itself seemed to be fraying around the edges. In the human section, Jack approached Tom with a new set of readings. "The pattern recognition algorithms have finished their analysis," he said quietly. "You need to see this." Tom studied the data, his eyes widening. "Are you sure about these results?" When Jack nodded, Tom turned to address the chamber. "Honorable representatives," he began, his voice cutting through the chaos. "We've been analyzing the entity's behavior since it first appeared. There's something you need to know." But before he could continue, new alarms blared. The entity had suddenly accelerated. The holographic displays updated, showing its new trajectory and speed. "No," gasped the council leader. "At this rate, it will reach the Centauri system in 3 days, not 7. The chamber erupted in fresh panic. The Centauri system was home to over 12 billion beings. The evacuation ships that had been planned wouldn't arrive in time now. The warrior race's representatives began shouting suggestions of last stands and glorious final battles. Tom looked at his team, then at the data streaming across their screens. The humans had discovered something important about the entity's nature, but in this chaos, nobody was ready to listen. The galaxy's bravest races were too busy planning how to die gloriously to consider that there might be another way. "Get me a direct line to Earth," Tom ordered quietly. "If they won't listen here, we'll have to take action ourselves." As the chamber descended further into chaos, the human delegation quietly began implementing their own plans. They had been called cowards for wanting to understand rather than fight. Now, with the galaxy's greatest warriors defeated and panic spreading across civilized space, perhaps it was time for the cowards to show a different kind of courage. The entity continued its advance, unstoppable and unknowable, while the clock ticked down toward catastrophe. While the Galactic Alliance Council chamber had devolved into chaos, the human research station Horizon floated silently in deep space, its sensors focused intently on the approaching entity. Inside, a team of scientists worked tirelessly, analyzing data streams that poured in from hundreds of specialized probes. "Look at these patterns," Dr. Wilson said, pointing to a complex series of energy waves displayed on the main screen. "They're not random. There's a rhythm to them, almost like breathing," Tom finished, leaning closer to the display. He had left the council chamber to join the research team, knowing this was where the real solution would be found. "It's alive." The revelation sent ripples through the research station. The entity wasn't a weapon or a natural disaster. It was a living being, possibly the largest ever encountered. "That's why our probes weren't destroyed," Jack said, pulling up more data. "Look here. When they get close to the entity, they don't break down like the warships did. They're just ignored." Tom nodded slowly. The warships were attacking it. They were perceived as threats. Our probes are just observing, gathering data. They're not threatening it, so it's not defending itself. The team had discovered something extraordinary. The entity's destructive effect on matter wasn't an attack. It was more like an immune system response. When it detected aggressive action, it simply removed the threat by unmaking it at a molecular level. "We need to show this to the council," Dr. Wilson insisted, but Tom shook his head. "They're not ready to listen yet," he said. "We need more than just theory. We need a solution." The research continued. Hours stretched into days as the human scientists worked to understand the entity's nature. While the warrior races prepared for their final stands, the humans watched, measured, and learned. "There's something else," a young researcher named Mike announced, calling the others to his station. "The entity isn't moving randomly. It's following something, some kind of energy signature we can barely detect." This was the breakthrough they needed. The entity wasn't mindlessly destroying everything in its path. It was following a specific route, drawn to something the humans hadn't yet identified. "If we can understand what it's following," Tom mused, "maybe we can give it a different path to follow." Dr. Wilson finished, excitement building in her voice. The team worked frantically, developing their theory. The entity was like a massive space-dwelling creature, following what appeared to be ancient migratory routes. Its path through populated space was simply part of a journey it had probably been making for millions of years. "We don't need to fight it," Tom explained during an emergency transmission to Earth. "We just need to give it a better path to follow, one that doesn't go through populated systems." The human scientists began designing a network of specialized energy emitters. These devices would create a trail of the exact energy signature the entity was following, but along a safer route through uninhabited space. When Tom finally returned to the council chamber with their findings, he found a very different atmosphere. The warrior race's representatives were subdued, their usual bravado replaced by grim resignation. "The humans have a plan," Tom announced to the chamber. He explained their discoveries, the nature of the entity, and their proposed solution. "We don't need to fight it. We just need to show it another way." "More cowardice," someone muttered, but the words lacked their usual bite. "Call it what you want," Tom replied calmly. "But our cowardly approach of watching and learning has given us something your bravery couldn't, a chance to survive." The chamber was silent as Tom laid out the plan. It wasn't glorious. It wouldn't make anyone a hero, but it might just save billions of lives. "We need your help," Tom concluded. "We need resources, construction ships, and access to key locations in uninhabited space. Will you help us, or would you rather die gloriously?" The council chamber remained quiet for a long moment. Then, slowly, the representatives began to nod. In the face of certain destruction, even the proudest warrior races were willing to try the humans' cowardly solution. The race against time began. Time was running out. The massive construction effort required to build the network of energy emitters was unlike anything the galaxy had seen before. Ships from every race worked together, following human designs and specifications, racing against the entity's advance. At a construction site in deep space, Tom watched through the observation window as robotic assemblers pieced together another emitter. The device looked deceptively simple, a crystalline sphere surrounded by intricate energy collectors and projectors. "The Battleborn crews are complaining again," Jack reported, joining him at the window. "They say this work is beneath them. Warriors shouldn't be reduced to construction duties." Tom sighed. Even with extinction looming, old prejudices died hard. Tell them they can either help build these devices or wait to be unmade by the entity. Their choice. The human solution had been met with skepticism and resistance. Many still saw it as a coward's approach, trying to trick the entity instead of facing it directly. But with no alternatives, even the proudest warriors had to swallow their pride. "Energy core installation complete on Sector 7, a voice announced over the comm system. The humans had divided the construction effort into sectors, each responsible for a portion of the diversion path they were creating. In the temporary command center, Dr. Wilson monitored the entity's approach. "Its speed is still increasing," she reported grimly. "We've lost 2 more unmanned observation posts to its dissolution field." The construction teams worked around the clock. The warrior races, for all their complaints, proved to be efficient workers when properly motivated. Their strength and endurance, usually reserved for battle, served well in the massive engineering effort. "Representative Corps is requesting an update," Jack said, checking his communications panel. "The Battleborn want to know if this coward's plan will actually work." Tom moved to the main communications screen, where Corps' scaled face appeared. The warrior's expression was a mixture of doubt and barely concealed hope. "The network is 70% complete," Tom reported. "Each emitter is designed to generate the exact energy signature the entity follows. When activated in sequence, they'll create an artificial path leading away from populated space." "And if your theory is wrong?" Core demanded. "If this thing doesn't follow your trail, then we'll be no worse off than we are now," Tom replied calmly. "But at least we'll have tried something besides suicide." The work continued. Hour by hour, the network grew. Human scientists supervised the calibration of each emitter, ensuring they would work in perfect harmony. The entity's path needed to be smooth and continuous. Any break in the chain could send it back toward populated systems. In the council chamber, the mood had shifted from outright hostility to nervous anticipation. The warrior races watched as their cowardly human colleagues orchestrated the largest cooperative engineering project in galactic history. "Final emitter placement in Sector 12, announced the construction coordinator. "Network completion at 95%. But time was running short. The entity's dissolution field had grown large enough to encompass an entire solar system. Its approach was visible now from populated worlds, a swirling mass of impossible colors that filled people with terror. "We need more time," Dr. Wilson said, studying the latest projections. "The calibration sequence isn't complete. We'll have to finish it with the entity already in range," Tom decided. It wasn't ideal, but they had no choice. "Alert all construction crews. Tell them to prepare for final activation." The galaxy held its breath. The mighty warriors who had once mocked human caution now found themselves depending on it. Every race watched as the human plan, born from observation and understanding rather than combat and confrontation, prepared for its ultimate test. As the entity drew closer, Tom couldn't help but appreciate the irony. The cowards who preferred to study rather than fight were now the galaxy's last hope. Sometimes, he reflected, the bravest thing you could do was refuse to fight when everyone else demanded battle. The network awaited activation, and with it, the fate of billions hung in the balance. The final moment had arrived. The network of energy emitters stretched across vast distances of space, each device precisely positioned and calibrated. In the command center, Tom stood before the main control interface, surrounded by representatives from every major race in the galaxy. "Starting activation sequence," Dr. Wilson announced. Her fingers moved across the controls with practiced precision. Emitters 1 through 10 powering up. The first section of the network hummed to life. On the massive display screen, points of light began to glow, creating the beginning of what they hoped would become the entity's new path. Energy signature matching previous readings, Jack reported, monitoring the output levels. The pattern is stable. The entity loomed closer, its massive form now visible to the naked eye from nearby systems. Its swirling colors and reality-bending effects made it difficult to look at directly. Activating sectors 11 through 20, Dr. Wilson continued. Each new sector that came online added to the artificial trail they were creating. Power levels holding steady. Representative Core watched the proceedings with barely concealed tension. Like many of the warrior races, he still struggled with the idea of redirecting rather than fighting the threat. "This had better work, human," he growled softly. Entity changing course. Someone shouted. All eyes turned to the main display. The massive creature had indeed altered its trajectory, ever so slightly. It was responding to the energy trail they'd created, just as the humans had predicted. A collective breath was held as they waited to see if it would fully commit to the new path. "Keep the activation sequence going," Tom ordered. "Smooth and steady. We don't want to startle it." More sectors came online, each one adding to the artificial pathway that would lead the entity away from populated space. The creature continued to adjust its course, following the familiar energy signature that the humans had so carefully replicated. But then something went wrong. "Power fluctuation in Sector 23, Jack called out. "The emitter is losing stability." The delicate energy pattern they'd created wavered. The entity hesitated, its massive form seeming to pulse with uncertain colors. "Reroute power from the backup systems," Tom commanded. "We can't lose the pattern now." Dr. Wilson worked frantically at her station, trying to stabilize the failing emitter. "The power grid is straining. We're pushing it beyond designed limits." The entity began to drift back toward its original course, straight toward the populated systems they were trying to protect. The warrior race's representatives tensed, their hands instinctively moving toward weapons that they knew would be useless. "Sector 23 stabilizing," Jack reported after several tense moments. Pattern integrity restored to 97%. They watched, hardly daring to breathe, as the entity hung suspended between two paths, the natural route it had been following and the artificial trail they'd created. "Come on," Tom whispered. "Follow our path." Slowly, almost gracefully, the entity began to turn. Its massive form oriented toward their energy trail, and it resumed its journey, now along the safe route they'd prepared. "It's working," Dr. Wilson exclaimed. "All sectors reporting normal operation. The entity is following our path." The command center erupted in celebration. Even the warrior race's representatives joined in, their previous disdain forgotten in the moment of triumph. The entity continued along its new course, its destructive field now harmlessly passing through empty space. The network of emitters performed perfectly, creating a clear path that would guide the creature safely around all populated systems. "I would not have believed it," Core admitted, approaching Tom. "To succeed without firing a single shot." Tom nodded. "Sometimes the best solution isn't the most obvious one. Sometimes you have to step back, observe, and find a different way." As they watched the entity follow its new path, the galaxy's understanding of courage began to shift. The humans' cowardly approach of study and comprehension had succeeded where all the bravery and firepower of the warrior races had failed. The threat wasn't destroyed. It was simply understood and redirected. And in that solution lay a lesson that would change galactic society forever. 1 month after the entity had been successfully guided away from populated space, the Galactic Alliance Council chamber was filled for a very different kind of meeting. Gone were the constant displays of battle prowess and warrior pride. Instead, there was a sense of thoughtful reflection in the air. Tom stood at the podium, presenting the final report on what had become known as the Entity Crisis. Behind him, holographic displays showed the creature's new path, now safely distant from any inhabited systems. The network continues to function perfectly, he explained. The entity has maintained its course along our artificial pathway. Our latest projections show it will exit the galaxy entirely within 6 standard months. The chamber was quiet, not the tense silence of fear, but the peaceful quiet of understanding. Representatives who had once mocked human caution now listened attentively. Representative Kor rose to speak, his warrior's armor notably absent. I move that we formally recognize the human approach to crisis management as a valid methodology, he announced. Their wisdom saved us all. The motion passed unanimously. It was unprecedented in galactic history. The warrior races officially acknowledging that combat wasn't always the answer. Furthermore, Kor continued, I propose we establish a new division within the Alliance, one dedicated to understanding threats rather than merely confronting them. Dr. Wilson, who had been invited to address the Council, stepped forward. We've already begun analyzing the data collected during the crisis, she said. There are more entities like this one out there. Following ancient cosmic paths we're only beginning to understand. The Council chamber buzzed with discussion. The idea of studying and redirecting threats rather than fighting them was revolutionary to many species, but they could no longer deny its effectiveness. The humans taught us something valuable, the Council leader declared. True courage isn't just about facing danger head-on. Sometimes it takes more bravery to step back, to think, to find another way. Jack, standing near the back of the chamber, leaned over to Tom. They're finally getting it, he whispered, though it took nearly losing everything to make them understand. The meeting continued with practical matters. Resources were allocated for a permanent monitoring network. Research stations would be established to study cosmic phenomena. The warrior race's mighty fleets would now be accompanied by scientists and observers. But what if we face a threat that does require combat? Someone asked. What if diplomacy and clever solutions aren't enough? Tom addressed this concern directly. Then we fight, he said simply. We're not advocating for never using force. We're suggesting that force shouldn't be our only tool. True strength lies in knowing when to fight and when to find another way. The council session concluded with a ceremony that would have been unthinkable just months ago. The humans, once mocked as cowards, were formally recognized as the saviors of galactic civilization. But more importantly, their methodology was accepted as a new form of courage. Later, in the observation lounge, Tom stood with Kor, watching distant stars. The entity was visible only as a faint shimmer in the far distance, following its new path through the void. You know, Kor said thoughtfully, my people have a saying. The strongest warrior is the one who knows all forms of combat. Perhaps we were too limited in our definition of combat. Tom smiled. And perhaps we humans needed to learn that sometimes standing firm is as important as knowing when to step back. We all had lessons to learn. As they stood there, news came in from across the galaxy. Other civilizations, hearing of the successful resolution of the entity crisis, were reaching out to learn this new approach. The humans' reputation was transforming from cowards to wise counselors. The galaxy was changing. The next crisis would find a civilization better prepared, not just with weapons and warriors, but with observers, thinkers, and those willing to seek understanding before action. In the end, the cowardly humans had not only saved countless lives, but had also taught the galaxy a new definition of courage. The bravery to think differently, to understand rather than destroy, and to find better ways forward. And somewhere in the vast darkness of space, guided by human ingenuity, an ancient cosmic entity continued its journey, unknowingly teaching one of the greatest lessons in galactic history.